In October 1962, the world held its breath. For 13 days, humanity stood on the brink of nuclear war. One wrong move, one rash decision, and civilization as we know it could have ended. This is the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the day the world almost ended. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union had been simmering since the end of World War II. Both superpowers were locked in an arms race, each determined to prove their dominance. In 1961, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, an attempt by the U.S. to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba, pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union. Fearing another invasion, Castro allowed Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev to secretly install nuclear missiles on the island, just 90 miles from the American coast. On October 14, 1962, American U-2 spy planes photographed missile sites under construction in Cuba. When President John F. Kennedy saw the images, he knew the world had changed overnight. Soviet nuclear weapons, capable of reaching Washington, New York, and beyond, were suddenly on America's doorstep. Kennedy gathered his advisors in what became known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. Opinions were divided. Some urged immediate airstrikes to destroy the missiles. Others warned this could trigger a Soviet retaliation in Berlin, or even spark nuclear war. Kennedy chose a middle path, a naval quarantine around Cuba to block further Soviet shipments. As U.S. warships surrounded Cuba, Soviet ships approached the blockade. The world watched, terrified, as it seemed the two nuclear superpowers were on a collision course. Meanwhile, missile sites in Cuba were being prepared to launch. In Washington and Moscow, leaders wrestled with the terrifying possibility that a miscalculation could unleash global destruction. Unknown to the public at the time, the most dangerous moment came not in Washington or Havana, but deep beneath the ocean. On October 27th, a U.S. Navy ship dropped depth charges near a Soviet submarine, B-59, trying to force it to surface. What the Americans didn't know was that this submarine carried a nuclear torpedo. Cut off from communication, overheated, and under pressure, the Soviet captain believed war might have already started. He wanted to fire. Launching that torpedo could have triggered an unstoppable nuclear chain reaction. But one man, Vasily Arkhipov, the second in command, refused to authorize the launch. His decision quite literally saved the world. As tensions peaked, Khrushchev sent two conflicting messages to Kennedy, one softer, one more threatening. Kennedy publicly responded to the first, promising not to invade Cuba if the missiles were withdrawn. Secretly, the U.S. also agreed to remove its own nuclear missiles from Turkey. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced the Soviet missiles would be dismantled. The crisis was over. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. It revealed the fragility of peace and the terrifying power of miscalculation. From it came new safeguards, a direct hotline between Washington and Moscow, and a greater effort toward arms control. But the story of Vasily Arkhipov, the man whose quiet defiance prevented catastrophe, reminds us that sometimes the fate of humanity rests not in grand strategies, but in a single moment of courage. For 13 days, the world stood at the edge of the abyss, and yet, against all odds, disaster was averted. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the day the world almost ended, and the day humanity got a second chance.